Now let's look at our mushrooms. So I basically modeled first a very low resolution one out of a basic sphere that I started to deform. And once I had the shape I wanted, the overall shape, what I did was I duplicated this mushroom. So I'm gonna do this entire workflow from scratch. So I'm gonna duplicate this low resolution one so you can see. So this is my initial overall shape, but I know that I want to add more details, especially texture to it, so that I have something similar to this. I want to have these kind of bumps around the top. So once I have my low resolution mushroom, I hit Shift D, and that duplicated this same geometry over itself. So now I have two shapes that are in the same location, and I'm gonna name this one high res mushroom so I can tell the difference between one and the other. And then my high resolution mushroom, I actually want to add much more subdivisions to it. So if I go to mesh and smooth, what smooth does is it adds subdivisions to it. So I can click and drag to add even more subdivisions. So something like this is good. And now I'm gonna hide my low resolution mushroom because I'm gonna be working over my high resolution mushroom to add these details to it. So these details are added by actually using the sculpting tools in Maya, and we haven't gone through these, and I'm just going to quickly go over them. So sculpting tools are kind of tools that you can use to add more of like sculptural details to your surface. And these tools are similar to what you can do with software such as Mudbox, for example. And you have all of these different options. So for sculpting, so you can pinch or lift the surface, or you can smooth it out, pull some parts of it, or flatten other parts. So let's try a couple of these. And whenever you are working with the sculpting tools, it's always good to open up Windows, and then under General Editors, look for your tool settings menu and click on that and make sure to have it open. So let's try this first. Actually, let's try this lift a surface. And so if you click on this, you'll see now my subdivisions have switched to gray, and this lets you know that you're on sculpting mode. And you can see the size of my brush is pretty large, right? So that's why it's important to have the tool settings, because by default you may have a brush that is so large that you can't even tell what it's doing to your surface. And you can change the size of your brush here. So let's try something like 0.05 for this mushroom. And then you can also change the strength of it. So if I start pulling, you can see now how I'm affecting it, and I can switch the strength and it'll be much more exaggerated, right? So these are just settings that you have to make sure you have correct so that you can actually affect and sculpt the way you want your geometry. So now I'm pulling some details, and maybe I want to flatten it a little bit too. So every time you switch brushes, it's important to check your tool settings again and make sure these numbers are correct. So I'm going to flatten some of these a little bit because they're too bulgy right now. And maybe I can add strength. So okay, so you get an overall idea of what this does. So this is my high resolution mushroom, and I've added so much detail to it that it will be much harder to work with things such as simulations in Maya with this high resolution mesh. And that's why it's important to have both your low resolution and your high resolution mesh, because if we do want to add things such as physics, we're actually going to tell Maya to calculate physics on our lower resolution mesh, but we're going to parent these together. So whatever happens to the low resolution mesh will also affect the high resolution mesh. But all the physics calculations will be done in the lower resolution mesh. So again, I have this same setup here in all of my other mushrooms. And now we're going to parent them to each other. So to do that, we want to have the low resolution object to be the parent, and the high resolution object should be the child. So if I middle mouse click my high resolution object and drag it into my low resolution, you'll see now that these two are grouped, or they're parented together. So if I press this plus button, you'll see now that I have these two together. And if I select the parent, which is in this hierarchy, the one at the top, and I want to move things around, you'll see that now, since they're parented together, anything I do to this higher up in the hierarchy mesh will happen to the one in the lower hierarchy. It's not the same if I only select the child of my parent, so the high resolution, and I drag it, it's not going to affect the parent, right? Because I'm just directly only affecting the child. But if I select the parent, it will affect the parent and its child. And that's why we want to have the low resolution be the parent, because that's the one we want to be affecting in our simulations. So I'm going to go ahead and parent all of the rest of my mushrooms together. And you can see here that I've named them. So there's the low resolution ones and then the higher resolution ones. And this will help me know which one should be grouped together. So for example, I have my low resolution mushroom and then my high resolution mushroom. So I'm going to middle click and drag it here. And now these are parented together. Now I'm going to go to number 1 with my low res and my high res, and middle click and drag it together, and these are parented, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now that everything is parented together, I should again go ahead and increment and save, because I've done this new step and everything is working properly. And now my next step is starting to animate. And for this exercise, I want to show you a little bit more about fields and solvers. And this means things like adding physics to your scene. So you can add things such as gravity and air and turbulence and wind and have them affect your objects. We had already gone through rigid bodies and active and passive rigid bodies, which we'll be using for the scene too. So to do this, first of all, another tip is checking the scale of your objects, because since we're going to start working with physics and simulations, we want to make sure we're working at a realistic scale so that everything behaves properly. Maya is kind of referencing the real world, so it's imagining units the way the real world works. So for example, if you were to 3D model a flag and make an end cloth for it and then add wind to it, you don't want to make a flag that is 2,000 feet by 2,000 feet, right? Because a cloth that size, like flags aren't normally that size. So if we do that, we're going to have to kind of exaggerate all our parameters, and it's very difficult to know the correct numbers and settings for this. So the safest way to work whenever you're working with physics and simulation is to kind of always work at a realistic scale. If you don't know what size your objects are, a trick to know is by hitting Control T on your keyboard. So you would select your object and hit Control T, and if you see, this box has appeared and it's showing me some numbers in the edges. So for example, down here I have 0.5 by 0.5, and then my height is 0.9. And what does this number mean if I don't even know what units I'm working in? So if you don't know what units you're working in, Maya by default should have something around inches. But in order to make sure you're working in the correct units, you can go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, and then click on Preferences. And if you go to Settings, you can see here your working units. Set yours to inches too, and that way you'll know that you're working at a realistic scale. So change it to inches and then hit save if for some reason it's not there. And so for example, now I know that this is a tiny mushroom, right? It's 0.38 inches, but it's fine. This is kind of a realistic possible scale. So as long as my mushroom isn't like 400 feet and it's a kind of realistic scale, it should be okay. If you want to get rid of this box, you just hit T on your keyboard and it should disappear. So again, Control T shows the box, and then just pressing T alone will take it out. So now that I know that everything is at a proper scale and I have all my elements, I'm going to start adding fields to it. And so to do that, we're going to make sure we are in our Effects menu. And we want to first assign things. So I know that my landscape is not going to be affected by the wind, for example. I want this one to stay still. So if I go to Fields and Solvers with my landscape selected, I can create a passive rigid body. So a passive rigid body means that it won't be affected by all of the fields that I add to it. And I actually want this tree to also be a passive rigid body. So I'm going to select it and create a passive rigid body. Now, I'm going to select my mushrooms. And I'm going to select the lower resolution versions of them. And with them selected, I'm going to create active rigid bodies. So what I'm telling Maya is that these mushrooms are going to be affected by things such as gravity and wind, right? And so now that I've assigned active and passive rigid bodies, I definitely would need to have gravity in my scene for any other field to work. So when working with Encloth, gravity by default gets assigned, but if we work with Fields and Solvers, we actually have to assign it. And again, we need to select the objects we want to have gravity affect. So I want to have all of my mushrooms be affected by gravity. So I'm going to first select them and then go to Fields and Solvers and hit gravity. And now make sure you have enough frames in your time slider, and if not, just stretch it out and add at least 1,000 frames. You should also make sure you're working at 30 frames per second. And now I'm gonna again select my mushrooms, and let's try and create something like air. And if I move my field closer, it will affect the way that it works on my object. So I want to have it near the objects that I want it to affect.